To be straightforward, I was asked to talk about looking at leadership. It's hard to find in the food and drink sector right now. It's hard to find in the agricultural sector right now. So I'll reference some other sectors. But I think it's important just to lay out the challenge that we face in terms of net zero. What are actually net zero targets about? Obviously, the theory is they're about achieving a 1.5 target under Paris. As you know, we're perilously close to not being able to achieve that target. And in fact, we can explicitly say, and the IPCC has just said this, we are definitely not on track to achieve it, right? Still technically possible. Falls into the line of technically possible. I spend a lot of my time working with scientists, the IPCC. We do a lot of the work on communicating climate science. And just to be clear, a 2-degree world is not a place you want to live. It's a very, very, very dark future. 1.5 isn't too pleasant either. And so these net zero targets need to be fast, they need to be very effective, and they need to stand up to scrutiny to actually deliver real emissions reductions. Now, we are at 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere as of today, give or take, right? Depends a bit on the day. You can argue about when exactly we go over that 1.5 limit, but it's some point in the next kind of 30 ppm. The food we eat and the way that we produce it is doing terrible damage to the planet. There's no doubt about that right now. Approximately 80% of medically important antibiotics sold in the US are fed to farm animals. According to UNEP, their International Livestock Research Institute, demand for meat and meat production are 2 of the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. Food and agriculture account for about 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And it is an established fact that even if you stopped all burning of fossil fuels for energy tomorrow, you could not reach the goals of the Paris Agreement without very, very significant change in the agricultural sector. So all these are just givens. We also have some other problems, obviously, in the food and agricultural sector. It's wildly inefficient. We know that, for example, about 80% of the nitrogen that's put onto land around the world goes into the environment around it. As such, obviously polluting water, polluting land, having a huge negative effect on ecosystems. Biofuels, for example, are taking about 2 to 3% of global water and land, currently used for agriculture. Give or take what would feed about 30% of the global malnourished population right now, and that's going into biofuels. There's an estimate that an 8% shift in the amount of grain we feed to cattle in Europe would make up for the grain shortage that was caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These kinds of numbers are absolutely all over the place. We have a huge amount of inefficiency in the system, and there are various reasons for that. There are choices that have been made over time, and there is the shape of the industry itself. We have about 15 companies that dominate, obviously, the food system. So that means there's massive potential for change. There's huge amounts of power in a very, very concentrated place that could make change. But there's also huge amounts of power that can decide not to make change. The ABCD traders that all of you know about are about 75 to 90% of the global grain trade, for example. You've got about 4 companies who dominate about 75% of the global pesticide market. So it's hugely intensified, right? And the focus, obviously, on intensive agriculture has been massive across these many years. And that's where, particularly let's talk about Europe, European policy has driven in that direction, right? And that's had a number of different effects over time. But one of them is that it's driven down farm incomes and it's driven up profits in the food sector to a very significant degree. Again, there's choices that are being made, right? The give or take, the estimate is about 21.3 million euros a year is spent on lobbying the European Union by agriculture and food interests. You've got things like the meat industry war room. I'm sure you all read the piece in the Washington Post on that investigation. Really interesting piece of work in terms of the acknowledgement of the significant threat that the climate crisis actually poses to the food industry, which is huge. Food production is one of the key sectors most affected by climate impacts. Droughts, floods, you name it, that gets hit very hard. And yet, where we are right now is that we're massively subsidizing the past, essentially, where there's huge billions and billions in subsidies going into the existing system. There's very, very, very little government money going into what the future could look like right now. Alternative proteins are in the hundreds of millions, for example, versus billions that are subsidizing the existing system. So you've got a number of very significant issues in the existing system. And what is clear is that we don't have an option to maintain the status quo. It will undo itself on its current trajectory. We also know that it's become hugely politicized. backlash against the nitrogen rules in Holland or in Netherlands are only one tiny part, right, of a much more complex political and socio-political set of questions around these things. Whether or not there needs to be change is not a question. How you do it is clearly an incredibly important question, right? And that's something that's going to need a lot of focus. There are examples of change. As I said, only about 5 years ago, there was zero public funding for alternative proteins. It's up to about 300 million a year now. Okay, getting somewhere. But you've still got, obviously, other incentives and alternative protein, processes that would need to come into place. You have got regulation starting to change things in some places. You've got, obviously, the work that's been done around pesticides. You've got a number of banks, asset managers, and other investors who are divesting from industries that are causing major environmental damage. That has included some food companies. And in 2020, 7 major European investment funds said that they would divest from beef producers, grain traders, and even government bonds in Brazil, for example, if they didn't tackle Amazon rainforest destruction. All these things are starting to happen, right? So there is a huge amount of pressure on the system from many, many, many different angles. And it's a really, really complex space in which to operate. Our take is that it is absolutely possible to turn it around, but there aren't any silver bullets. I've been working in the climate space. I came out of corporate. I used to run government affairs for Apple. I've been in the climate space for over a decade now. There are no silver bullets, right? This is not a space which lends itself to easy answers, sadly, right? It's always, the answer is always and, it's never or. And so there's a lot that needs to get done. But there are a few things that I think we can do. Help farmers transition from the fertilizer and pesticide trap, right? That is going to be absolutely key in all of this. The role of pesticides, the way that farmers play a role in the social fabric of countries, in the political fabric of countries, and in this industry is something that's going to have to be taken into account. Like, they are the people who are going to have to be at the core of a lot of the transition plans. And I'll come back to transition plans in a minute when I'm talking about sectors that have done this reasonably well. We've got to diversify what we grow and eat. That's going to be absolutely key. There's a European study, actually, I think funded by the Commission, but that found that a transition to a mixed farming system could cut agricultural emissions by 47% compared to 2010, while maintaining export capacity and supplying enough food for 530 million Europeans. But that's a system-level take, right? That's not one company doing one thing. That is everyone working very, very much in lockstep to get these changes to happen, because every link in the chain is going to be vital, obviously, all the way from, to use the phrase, the farm to the fork. The repurpose agricultural subsidies for a thriving rural economy. That, again, is going to be absolutely key. We have these incredibly inefficient subsidies. I think there's no point in getting into a debate about the history of the common agricultural policy at this point, but we know that there's vast inefficiencies in that system, and it's not targeted to do what needs to be done, which is help the social fabric of those communities as they transition, because they will have to transition. There is no question, right? That's not a choice, because otherwise this stuff is just going to get burned up and fall apart. That is going to be absolutely key. We know that there is vast amount of job creation in investing in sustainable agriculture, in investing in nature food systems, like huge amounts of studies. Again, I'm very happy to send anybody all the links to all these various bits of evidence. Changing the way we farm and produce food, give or take, according to the WEF, no less, the World Economic Forum, would produce about $4.5 trillion a year in new business opportunities. We need to be more efficient in how we use our land, right? Reducing food waste could feed about 2 billion people. There's massive, massive amounts to do there. That's twice the number of malnourished people in the world, right? And could also generate, obviously, massive savings. And this is the rich world, need to rethink our protein intake. A lot of us are eating twice as much as we need right now in terms of protein. And as I said, an 8% reduction in cereals for animal feed, could literally make up the shortfall we've experienced. And the key to this is the creation of national food and farming plans for transition. The energy sector has been forced into this space quite a long time ago, right? And you have had integrated national energy transition plans. Now, they've got more nationalized pieces of it. There's more of a history of regulation in that space. There are structures which connect the various pieces of the food chain, if you will, in the energy industry. But we have seen over the last 5 years a meteoric rise in renewable deployment across Europe, and it has not happened by accident. It has been planned, right? And literally, the only people who got close to predicting the scale of the rise in renewables in Europe, weirdly, were Greenpeace, right? Say what you will. The IEA got it wrong. The Commission got it wrong. Everybody else underestimated it. And even Greenpeace underestimated it, right? But the scale of the growth is absolutely massive. Now, there is a huge amount to do, right? We're still pushing up towards 20% of European energy. There is a vast amount more to do. But it was an integrated approach that got us there. You know, they put rules on the grid. They've worked out access points. There's still a lot to be done, but there was an integrated plan across the piece. And what is clear is you're going to need a plan that goes all the way from how we're dealing with the socio-political issues in local communities, all the way up to the way that the market incentives work at the traders level and everything in between in order to get there. End of. Thank you.